Hi, I'm Rachel Herget. I'm here with Sarah Vowell, this year's freshman Convocation speaker. I think Sarah needs a little introduction, especially in Bozeman. She's an MSU graduate, a Bozeman High School graduate, before eventually becoming an author and commentator. Her voice is pretty immediately recognizable, especially to cartoon fans, as Violet from The Incredibles and the sequel. Her 7 nonfiction books include Unfamiliar Fishes, chronicling the odd history of the state of Hawaii, a diary of a year of listening to the airwaves on Radio On, and most recently, Lafayette in these Sometimes United States, a look at the American Revolution through the guise of our first celebrity, the Marquis de Lafayette. So here we are in Montana State University's library in special collections. How does it feel to be back on campus?
I grew up on this campus being from Bozeman, so it feels pretty homey to me.
Mm-hmm. So you, in your time here, worked in the library, but not this library, right?
There was an art and architecture library. I worked at that library. I worked at the Museum of the Rockies. I worked at KGLT. I worked at the art gallery in the sub. I had a lot of jobs.
And it seems like you wear a lot of hats in your current life as well, years and years later.
Sort of. It seems that way. Mostly I just, sit in a room by myself, thinking.
Well, then looking back at your time
Not to over-glamorize what I do.
Looking back at your time here, then, how did you find a balance between the work in school and that heavy workload and your busy social life?
Oh, well, I mean, in some ways I did not have any balance, but I think I've never really thought of work as, it's not that I don't think of it as work, but my social life was very connected to all of my jobs. I also worked at the Pickle Barrel. So, 30 years later, all the people I'm still friends with are the people I worked with at KGLT and the Pickle Barrel and the museum and the art gallery. And so work was part of my social life. I had a boyfriend that I met at KGLT, and then he also worked at the Pickle Barrel. So there was a lot of my socializing was I was getting paid for, I guess. So I was pretty busy here. There wasn't a ton of free time, and I did take classes, and I did, work pretty hard at those. So I think it was. I mean, this is for the incoming first-year students, right? I really would recommend getting involved, especially if you're lonesome and you're from out of state or from somewhere else. And I mean, it's just a really great way to meet people. And I don't know, there's just something about friendships just accelerate when you have a common goal. Or, I mean, sometimes, like at the Pickle Barrel, that goal was, let's get these people their sandwiches. But, I'm still pretty good friends with some of the women I met working on the art gallery. And we did everything. We swept the floor and painted the walls, and we planned the exhibits, and we also brought in guest speakers. So we were a real team, and I think that kind of speeds up friendships, I guess.
Yeah. Do you draw from any of the lessons learned in that variety of jobs and activities on your writing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, another place I worked was the Exponent, which is the student newspaper. So that's actually how I got started in newspapers. Let's see. I mean, KGLT, the college radio station, that was pretty important to me. I was a DJ, but I was also, there used to be a newscast. And so we would produce the newscast, and then I would anchor the news. And so, I would get to campus at 6 a.m., pull wire service reports off it's been a while, it was a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and then I would splice it with a razor blade. So I think that environment, it was a really great place to work, a lot of really interesting unconventional people, and we all had this, common purpose of that radio station. And I think my whole career, I mean, writing books is pretty solitary, but I've been involved in various, magazines and newspapers and various broadcasting entities, and I'm always looking for that sort of group paying environment in a workplace. Like if I'm going to work on something other than one of my own books, I'm pretty unprofessional in that I have to like the people I work with, So I think that had a big effect on me because, I started working there when I was 18 years old, and it really formed how I thought of a workplace. And it was also really coeducational. It was just, men and women working together, and then there are a lot of hangers-on from the community who stick around. And, one guy who does a show, Timothy Tate, he was there when I was there, and he still has a show, and there was it was really supportive too. Like I had this radio show, it was called The 20th Century, where I played a lot of really noisy 20th century classical music where like my requests, like people would call and the requests were always, please stop playing this. And I remember, one of the older DJs, Barrett Golding, who's still a DJ there, I remember him saying, I really hate your show, but I'm really glad it exists, So it was, it was a great thing about being in college and just trying stuff out. And I don't know, like, how it is now. Is KGLT an accepted part of the university community? Like,
I don't know that everyone knows that KGLT is as connected to the university.
Do they play KGLT in the student union building on the lounge?
And I really miss that.
Oh, well, in my day they did not. And it was a thing. And because, it was, I think it was a lot of people from student government and people who were in sororities and fraternities. That's where I learned the most valuable lesson. It doesn't matter if you control the microphone if someone else controls the loudspeaker, And so I would always try and argue with those people who are in charge of the loudspeakers. I'm going up there to broadcast for 30 miles, but no one can hear me in the building. And I think that's a really great thing about being a student at a public university. It's not this, like a lot of smaller colleges, everyone's kind of alike and has the same priorities and tends to think alike. And at a big university, not everyone's going to be on board with what you're doing, and that is a very valuable lesson to learn, I think. Like, I took a lot of art history classes here. That's what I wanted to do. And I remember taking the first year art history class, and it was a lot of the kind of random people you get at a public university in Montana. So all of my introductory courses at this school, there were always guys in cowboy hats, And that doesn't happen that much if you're at a small liberal arts college in the Northeast or something. So there was always there were always arguments in a way that, I remember we were studying modern art history, and a slide of the artist Kandinsky, one of the Kandinsky paintings came up. And I remember this guy in a cowboy hat just had a meltdown. He could not believe he had to look at this. It's a weird, I believe it's Composition 7. And it's a very, as he said, splotches, which is accurate. Some people like splotches, he didn't. and I only thought about that years later because I did go on and do art history for graduate school, and I had to teach first year art history, and I taught Kandinsky. And I remember going in that day what are we going to say about this, because that guy had a total meltdown, and everyone had to talk about people who liked the painting really had to defend it here at MSU. If you like splotches and a guy in a cowboy hat is telling you he doesn't, you have to think of all the things that are valid about this painting, right? So but all of my students were art students, and we got to the Kandinsky slide and nothing. They were all cool with it.
You were waiting for the splotches.
Right.
And there were no
so they were
comments
all
about
like,
splotches.
they were all fine with it. I don't know that anyone loved it, but no one hated it, And so there was like no discussion. And so much at MSU, I remember taking film class where there was in the course catalog, it made it sound like you were going to watch movies, And then you got there, and the head of the film department was really into German movies from the 60s and 70s, so it was all German cinema. And I mean, a lot of the people in the course had never seen a foreign film before, And so, I mean, I grew up in Bozeman. It was a pretty pretentious town film-wise when I was growing up, and so I was just fascinated. Like, I wouldn't even watch the movies. I would just watch the guys in the cowboy hats watch the movie because their reactions were always like so outlandish, and they really hated every single movie. But it was just I liked a lot of the movies, but it's really educational to be around people who do not like what you like, and I think it's one of the values of the public university, the way the country is now, because people get so segregated and they're only around people who agree with them. They only consume news media that fits their own political views. And in a big campus like this, like the citizenship possibilities are so abundant just because of proximity, because all these different people, I mean, Montana doesn't seem like that diverse of a state, but you have people from the farms and ranches and people from Butte, which is its own thing that no one has ever figured out, and people from the reservations, and then people from the towns, and then I think half the entering classes from out of state. And so you have this opportunity that no one gets except for people who join the military, of being like thrown together with all these different kinds of people. And generally what happens when a lot of different kinds of people are thrown together is they like each other, or they can at least, coexist.
So is that what you mean
What was your question? I'm sorry.
Is that what you mean by the E pluribus unum implications that you wrote about in the New York Times?
Yeah, out
piece?
of many one. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this country is so, everyone's so cut off from everybody else. And there's just something kind of beautiful about being thrown in with, all these different kinds of people, really religious people. I mean, I'm a secular person, but I remember taking this one seminar where there was like a really, really devout girl. Like she would not forgive the Greek poet Homer for being born before Jesus Christ. And if you really wanted to get on her nerves, you would just say the word Poseidon, and then she just didn't want to hear any of that. And I remember, like, sometimes she really dragged down the Greek literature section of the course, but then when we got to the Renaissance, or we were reading St. Augustine's Confession, and, she started talking about her faith and her own self-doubts, and, like, how would you talk about this, book about faith in a classroom where there's no person of faith in the classroom, which happens in a lot of smaller colleges, so the opportunity, I mean, for me, like, the most useful tool in my job is empathy. And I don't mean that like niceness. I mean really trying to see another person's point of view, or some dead person's point of view. Just like, it's how you understand how the world is the way it is, So, I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. When I was writing about the history of Hawaii, by the end of the 19th century, the native Hawaiians had lost control of their country because it was its own country, and the children of the missionaries who arrived there earlier in the century, by the end of the 19th century, white people owned about 90% of the land. And so, and they overthrew the Queen of Hawaii. So among native Hawaiians, they're not big fans of those people. And they're like seen as real villains in a lot of, quarters in the Hawaiian Islands, and for obvious good reason. But when I was researching, so these missionaries came over from New England in the 1820s, and then they stuck around, and then their children grew up in Hawaii and didn't know anywhere else. And when I was, in the archives of the Mission Houses Library, which is where one of the missionaries lived when he came to Honolulu in the 1820s, there was this letter. So they were sponsored by this missionary group in New England, and for decades. And there is the letter they got from Boston saying, we're cutting you people off. So for decades, they'd had all this support from New England to continue their missionary work. Boston sends them letters like, sorry, we're done with you. And all of these people are stuck there. Some of them have never lived anywhere else. I mean, in a way, they're kind of like the dreamers, right? They were born there. They just didn't know anywhere else, and they suddenly have to make a living. Mm-hmm. And it's a place with 365-day growing seasons, so they go into agriculture. And that's how they start racking up all this land and starting sugar plantations. And that's how the Hawaiians lost control of their own land. And it's still not a good story, but you can understand at least how it happened. It wasn't like a bunch of, evil people deciding to take over one day. It just happened slowly, where they start buying up more and more land to grow sugar, and they start making more money, and then they have more money to buy more land to grow more sugar, and that's how that happened. And so it's at least a way to understand the truth of what happened there.
Is there a certain attitude or mindset going into research on a topic like this that you need to kind of stay back and not
at
make
first
assumptions?
at first it's just vacuum. You just have to be a vacuum cleaner. Like when I start a book, I have some general notion, and then I just start reading everything I can, and then just keep getting narrower and narrower and more specific. So I'll read all the, I'll read all the main books about something, then I'll start reading biographies, then I'll eventually get to a point where I might have to go to an archives, like with that book, because a lot of it was about missionaries. And there have been a few books on those missionaries, but it's not a topic that generally a bunch of people want to write about or read about, so you have to go to the archives, and a lot of it is just sitting there paging through their letters, I remember I was so bored one day, and the breaking point was someone on Kauai heard someone on Maui was going to Honolulu, and they asked, hey, could you pick me up some gloves? It's a lot of that. So you really have to spend a lot of quantity time to find the good stuff, And sometimes I would be over there for a few weeks or months even. And I remember one time I came home and my friend Sherm was like, how are you less tan? Because I was just in the state archives for weeks on end, under lights like these. So it's a lot of, you just have to keep reading and reading and reading and looking. And I don't know, sometimes the thing you want, the interesting thing will jump out at you, but it's a lot of wasted days. And sometimes I see that in more traditional historians than I am, where you can tell they put a lot of effort and travel time and actual time into finding something out. And because they've had to go through that, they want the reader to share some of that pain, So a lot of what I do is I'll spend a few weeks trying to figure something out or learning about it, and then I'll realize this is boring, this is irrelevant, no one cares, and I will spare the reader that, but it's just, or sometimes you realize, what, I remember working on a book about presidential assassinations, and it ends with a whole chapter about the Lincoln Memorial. And before the Lincoln Memorial was built, it took decades and decades, and there were all these Washington commissions on how should we memorialize Lincoln for decades. And I I learned about all of them. I read the transcripts, and I had this whole long thing about all these commissions, and then I read what I'd written, and it's like, no one cares, and then I just whittled that down to maybe 3 sentences.
So there's not going to be a book on the Lincoln Memorial?
No, but okay. I remember one time at MSU, one of the film students had made his student film, and it was all highway signs. It was just a film of various highway signs, and I remember it was so boring. It was just highway signs, and like there would be a highway sign, it would say Boise, and then there would be another highway sign that would say, St. Regis or whatever, and that was the whole film. And I remember the film professor who was critiquing this movie, he was like, who is this film for? Other highway signs? So sometimes I think about that, if I've gotten like too inside with whatever I'm working on, am I just writing something for other highway signs,
It's a good thing to tell yourself. Mm-hmm. So you've talked about film classes and art history classes, and I know you were a French major here at MSU.
Uh-huh.
How did you decide what to do after college based on your wide variety of interests?
I mean, one doesn't entirely decide. One thing, I was just researching, the differences between public universities and elite universities. And I was looking into the State Department, and the article was about why does the State Department only hire Ivy League grads, or mostly hire. And the, what's that called? Human Resources executive who's in charge of hiring, she actually went to Louisiana State. And she said, I just fell into this. I didn't know about this place. And she said, the exam to get into the State Department to work there is so difficult. Anyone who passes that exam, they're qualified. But she said a lot of her coworkers who went to more elite universities, they'll say things like, oh, I've wanted to work here since 3rd grade. And, she was like, I just fell into this. And all of these other people, they know about it. They know people who work there, and they think, oh, this is a career for me. So, some of my path was just determined by like something I'd heard of. Like I only figured this out a few weeks ago. When I finished MSU, I got an internship at the Smithsonian in the Archives of American Art, which I got it because I had worked at the archives at the Museum of the Rockies and this library system, I think. But the reason I knew to apply for that was my sister had done a Smithsonian internship after high school. And the reason she knew about it was because our dad saw a notice in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle that the Smithsonian was looking for interns. So a lot of what happened to me was just, things I knew about. And so I went there, and I could still be working there, I think. And that would have been probably a very nice life. I maybe should regret that, but I was young, and I decided, I wanted to like see more of the country, and I wanted to go on to graduate school. So I just kept, and I went to the graduate school, the one graduate school I got into, So a lot of like my dream was to go to the Berkeley Art History Department and get a PhD. They did not share this dream. So like I went to the one school that accepted me, and it just so happened that that school was in Chicago, and that's how I met Ira Glass, who was at the time working for National Public Radio, and he was about to start his own radio show called This American Life, and then I started working for him in that show, and that was just random. That would never have happened if my dreams had come true. So a lot of the good things that happened to me came out of disappointment or failure. And I've come to the conclusion that young people want the wrong things, Like, I don't think I was really cut out for a career in academia. And when I was in Chicago teaching art history, that's when I knew, oh, like some days I would just hate my students. They were so lazy, or they just wouldn't listen to me, or I would be really excited about something and they just wouldn't care. And like a good teacher can see that as a challenge and bring those students into their, circle of enthusiasm. But I just didn't have that talent. So a lot of what happened to me was kind of random. The only through line is that whatever I was doing, I always worked hard. So that's a boring lesson. It's true, though.
So did the work for This American Life then lead to some of the voiceover work, like Violet?
I mean, that's the only voiceover work I've done. And the director was cast. He was thinking about casting that movie, and he heard one of my public radio documentaries. So
it's like, that is my voice.
Yeah.
That is who I need. So you said...
None of this is really repeatable. I'm just saying, like, I can't, like, oh, how do you get into voice work? Make public radio documentaries, or like to be in a cartoon, or how do you write books? Fail at several other jobs before that, like the only thing I can say is to always be open to opportunities and to work hard when you get them. Because I noticed that, like, when I speak at colleges, that question, how did you decide your career path? I did not decide my career path. A lot of things were decided for me, and I think that's true of most people.
But it is very much about the connections you've made and your own personal choices, and then following through with those opportunities. And those,
Right.
I think, are important lessons
Yeah.
for college students.
And also, like, especially,
the rest of us.
when I was in my 20s trying to make it as a freelance writer, which was really hard in the 20th century, and I imagine even more difficult now, because we still had newspapers and magazines who would pay you, though not very much. Well, where was I going with that? I didn't specialize. It took me several years I was always writing, but I made so little money at each job. I just had to work so much. I was writing record reviews and producing public radio documentaries and doing interviews for magazines and book reviews and working for weekly newspapers, like all at once. And I did that for years and years. I just never said no to any job I couldn't afford to. And that really was the best thing I could have done, because I just got so much experience, and I slowly found out what I was good at and what I wasn't as good at, And one reason, I started writing about history when I was working on This American Life. I made this one historical documentary, and it was right around the time I was slowly realizing I'm really not that great of a reporter. I'm not always so good with people who are alive, like sometimes I would hit it off with someone, but sometimes I really would not. And sometimes I didn't want to pry, like if you're going to be a really good reporter, you have to be a jerk. Like, you have to pry. You have to ask someone who's in mourning questions about, their loved one, or you really have to get in there and make them uncomfortable to get the story. And I'm not really like that, but for whatever reason, the dead people, I had the patience to, read all 4 volumes of James Garfield's diaries and find the 2 sentences that were worth talking about, I could just read just volumes of really, really boring material and find the thing that had emotion or action or just an idea or something. And so I'm just more comfortable with those who are no longer with us, or I don't know. I could always just find the thing about them that reminded me of someone who I know, or try to make the dead come back to life. That was just something I stumbled into. But by the time I stumbled into that, I just had so much experience writing on deadline and just Like, the best thing you can do, whatever you're going to do in life, is to just get as much experience doing it over and over again as much as you can. And so not specializing those first few years, I didn't have a choice, but it turned out to be a really good training, I think.
What sort of historian do you consider yourself? You said earlier in this conversation that you weren't a real historian.
I don't think of myself as an historian. I mean, I just think of myself as a writer. So whatever I'm writing about, I have the same approach, whether I'm writing about, current events in politics now or the current events of the 1630s. It's kind of all the same to me. So because I care as much or more about the writing than the actual subject. I care a lot about the subject, but I don't know. I still think of it as journalism.
What part of the writing is most of interest to you?
Rewriting. I like editing and, I like everything. I have this friend who has this theory that there are happy creators and unhappy creators. I'm definitely an unhappy creator. And I will always choose the hard way. And getting to a first draft is really, really difficult for me. But everything after that is just a joy. Like, I love to, some things I'll write. What's a number that doesn't sound mentally ill? 50 drafts, and I'm just really hard on myself. But that's where I live, like getting in there in each sentence and really not just saying what I want to say, but finding the most specific way to say something. And I don't know, like I'm really hard on myself in a way that other people aren't, because I just love the polishing, Like a couple of years ago, I was editing a book with some high school students, and I had to write the introduction to the book. And I wrote a first draft. I gave it to my co-editor. He's like, "This is perfect. I wouldn't change a word." I did 17 more drafts, obviously, he is not being hard on me. I'm going to have to be hard on myself. So I did 17 more drafts, and the 17th draft was way better than the first draft, So, I just love all that stuff, which is basically like making something prettier, or making it funnier, just making it more specific. Because usually in the first draft, especially if you're me, it's easy to repeat myself. And so I'm always thinking back, have I used that word in this context before? And if so, I'll try to think of another word. Or, I don't know, just is that a verb that everyone uses to describe this situation? In which case, I'll try to think of something else. Am I comparing something to, am I comparing a president to a president when I should be comparing him to a kind of pie? How do you make something as alive and specific as possible? And so for me, that part, everything after the first draft, I'm happy. Everything up to that is just a slog.
Do you feel like a lot of the humor comes in within these rewrites? We talk about pie.
Some of it comes in, but a lot of it goes out. And I mean, as the older I get, it depends on the situation. But when I'm writing in the New York Times, I only have a certain amount of space. And if I have a bee in my bonnet about some issue, and I'll cut a joke if it's something I think the Secretary of State should see, that was funny, but I need this guy to think about this one idea. Or you have to think about, in a newspaper like that, who's going to read it. And so a lot of times I'll just cut jokes more and more if there's just a point I want to make. And so it just depends on what my priorities are.
You seem in your writing to have developed a very specific voice that's this, we have historical accuracy combined with a little bit of humor and snark, which I love. How did that come about for you?
I don't know. I don't know how other people think. It's how I think. I mean, I try to be a full person. Some of that, I think, actually is a result of having worked on This American Life, because when you're a journalist, generally you get stuck in a hole. Like they put you in if you're funny, they put you in the funny hole. If you're, political, they put you on the campaign trail. If you're serious or you know about economics, you're in that section. There are sections, like especially of old-fashioned magazines, there are sections, and rarely do people jump sections. And I think one thing I loved about This American Life is it was all about the story. So the tone of a story dictated how you told whatever the story was, that would dictate the tone. So some of the pieces were funny and silly, and others were like really serious documentaries. And sometimes even in the serious documentaries, there's joking around or whatever. And I just never learned how to separate my whole humanity from my work in a way that wasn't always lucrative for me. I mean, I was making a pretty good living as a magazine writer for a while there. I don't know if this will shock you, but public radio and weekly newspapers wasn't exactly a cash cow. And I started working for, these magazines like GQ and Esquire and those kind of magazines, and they paid pretty well back in the day. But I remember when I started becoming a better writer, my stories would get killed because they would, like, Esquire once sent me to Gettysburg, and they were like, this is really funny until you get to the part where 50,000 people die. I was like, well, it was funny until you're standing next to these tombs. Mm-hmm. Both things were true of my experience there. And I stopped being able to fit into a section. And so then I just concentrated more on writing my own books. But, and I mean, I find audiences, they like a person to be a certain thing. Mm-hmm. Like one time I was signing books and this guy said, you know what I hate about you? Which was always a great way to start a sentence. You know what I hate about you? I can't put you in a box, and I need to be able to put people in boxes. And I was like, yeah, I hate that about me too. But
not my problem.
But like well. The whole world is set up to put people in boxes. And if you don't fit in the boxes, that can be uncomfortable, and also you lose work because of it sometimes. Or, people want, they don't like it. Like, I remember, back in my day, Bill Murray made a serious movie. Everybody hated it when Bill Murray made a serious movie, but it's like, he's got to do what he needs to do. So, all the things that make me, I think, a good writer sometimes make it harder for me to make a living as a writer,
So there is a pressure there to kind of tone it down because...
No, there's a pressure if you're funny to keep being funny and only be funny. But, I mean, I'm telling stories about American history. It's a bloodbath. It's not, it's not going to be all jokes all the time. And... suck it up, audience. Like, that's my feeling. I can't, if I'm telling this whole story of this country that's pretty grisly, it's not all fun and games, I mean, my policy is, like, let's, like, find joy when you can. But, I mean, I also have a policy when I'm working on something, like, sometimes things are so sad or so tragic or just so violent. I have a rule that I just have to stop and dwell on it, like writing about presidential assassinations. Sometimes I would really get a real sense of what those widows went through, and I would just drop everything and just be with them in their grief, And so, sure, lots of funny stuff happened along the way on the way to visit some of those historic sites, but the story is, I mean, a country or a person, there's so much fullness there, and I'm not going to limit myself. And sometimes, though, when I'm doing readings, like an audience, a live audience especially, just wants to laugh. And they're just like gluttons for it, And sometimes if I'm reading something funny and I know we're about to turn on a dime and something horrifying is about to happen, I have to do things with my voice to save them from themselves, because otherwise when I get to the, like, whoever's about to be brutally massacred in the next paragraph, they're going to start hating themselves because they're still laughing, you know? So it's like, if you can make people laugh, that's what they want you to keep doing. But a lot of these stories, that's just not possible, you know, if you want to tell the whole story.
How do you go about connecting these historical events with the future, now, the present, really, I guess? You go back and forth in a lot of your books between...
I mean, a lot of the relevance is pretty self-evident. Like, what? I mean, there was that book I wrote about Hawaii. I was writing about that during the Iraq, after we got into the second Iraq war, starting, you know, when we went to war in 2003, and that was all about regime change, and it was kind of this, like, it felt like a rehashing of the Spanish-American War era, which is how the United States acquired Hawaii from those missionary kids who overthrew the Queen of Hawaii. During the whole, like, summer, basically, America became an empire. In one summer, we you know, in that one war, we picked up Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Hawaii, you know, really within a few weeks. And so, and we were, like, that war going into Iraq and trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein, there were just certain similarities to me about, like, the American kind of missionary impulse to, you know, sort of stick our noses in these places where we don't necessarily belong because of our own missionary sense of purpose, and you know, our idea of ourselves as inherently good. And
so the history felt very relevant.
Yeah, or like this book on Lafayette, it was honestly just sparked by learning how beloved he was, and how by pretty much all Americans. And, like, from the get-go, this country has just been a discombobulated, bickering mess, you know, but always, you know, he was so beloved. Like, when he came back in 1824 and his ship pulled into New York Harbor, I think 80,000 people were there to greet him, and the population of New York City was 120,000. So he was so beloved. And I thought it would be a nice break from our, you know, the rancor of being an American, to just write about this one guy Americans always liked. But it turns out at every point in the story, like, he's there and they all love him, but they're all just, like, bickering with each other. The Americans are just, you know, the army and the Congress can't get along. And then later when he comes back in 1824, there's a, like, really rancorous presidential election, and that's the whole thing. And they all like him, but all we do is argue, you know, so joke was on me.
How does Lafayette in Hamilton compare to what you know of him?
Oh, Lafayette in Hamilton. Lafayette in Hamilton.
Famous fighting freshman.
For one, I mean, that actor, David Diggs, who originated that role, a lot more hair than real Lafayette, who was pretty much bald by the time he was 20.
He does kind of have this lovely black
Hamilton
curly.
is a little more a heightened version of the story, and I mean, there are certain things like the panache and you know, the gung ho. Like Lafayette was a very gung ho soldier, which was very valuable in an army where, you know, people were deserting, and he was just so adamant, and kind of a little bit of a puppy dog. So I would say Lafayette in Hamilton is a little more cool, you know, because like Jefferson said, he called Lafayette canine. Like, he was kind of a puppy dog. He was just so enthusiastic, and I think the Lafayette of Hamilton is a little more cool. Yeah.
So we're talking about historical connections. What is interesting you in history now? What are you working on?
Let's see. I was just working on the Higher Education Act of 1965. Right now, I'm working on a political story, like trying to figure out how the census is going to affect Montana. And, you know, because the census isn't really going that well in Montana because there's this virus, as you know.
Yes.
And it's making it really harder to get an accurate count in the rural counties and on the reservations. So that's a concern. So that was what I was working on this morning, thinking about that, because the federal government just moved up the deadline on the census, and
By a month.
by a month.
Yeah.
And I think it was the directive of the president, who is a Republican, but I kind of think that hurts Republicans. So because it's going to mess up representation in the legislature if the rural counties can't get counted properly. There's also the issue that, you know, Montana used to have 2 congressional seats in the U.S. House, and we've only had 1 since, I think, around 1992, so we could get that second seat. Because right now we have, even though we have such a low population in the state, we have the largest congressional district by number because the whole state is one district. So that's what I was working on today, thinking about that.
So
I just want people to be counted, you know. I mean, every single person, like you and I, the state of Montana, over 10 years will get 20 grand for like each of us. You and I sitting here, we're $40,000 worth of resources that go into education or roads or whatever, you know. So the more people can be counted, the better it is for the whole state. And these are the things that I care about, that I think everyone should care about.
And specifically in Bozeman, if we go over that 50,000 mark,
Right.
we hit the next level in terms
I
of
think
city size, and that brings in more federal funding.
Right, yeah. It's all about that. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, you're from here, right?
I am.
And I mean, that's part of what this piece is about too, is part of the reason we could get another congressional seat is more people live in Montana now, and thinking about the consequences of that. And certainly, like, Bozeman has obviously grown so much in my lifetime, and what are the consequences of that? And I think for a college student, they're really crucial because, you know, all these people come in, the cost of living goes up. I mean, when I was going to MSU, my rent was $110 a month.
I knew that was going to hurt my heart.
Yeah, right. So, and, you know, I could, like, swing that on minimum wage. And now I think, like, my $110 a month house on the north side would probably cost me, like, the equivalent 10 times more. But I think minimum wage hasn't even gone up 3 times since I was making minimum wage in the late 80s, you know? So all of this stuff is so fascinating to me, like just the specifics of Montana especially, and writing about Montana for a national audience to try and, you know, humanize this place and give the people in the rest of the country all these details so they come to know us.
I love the little tidbits you throw in, like especially the New York Times articles recently with the Rock and R Bar and the organic goat farm in Belgrade. That one was good.
Yeah, well, those people make really good goat cheese.
They do.
And I just had some of their ham, which is also good. But I mean, another goal of mine is to always have a sense of place. And
do you think that comes from being a Montanan?
I think so. And especially being, like, this town is so interesting, like Bozeman and Missoula, and to a certain extent Helena, because of the legislature. These are the places where everyone from Montana congregates. So you sort of learn about the whole state by all these people from all over the state coming and you know, seeing their differences and just learning about their hometowns. I think it gave me a much better sense of this town, but also the whole state and just the breadth of the people and the economies. And so, yeah, but like that's just about, some of that is about a sense of place and some of it is just being specific.
Do you take notes on the specifics of a place when you're visiting? Or?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's like part of why I see more what I do as journalism as opposed to history, because the place itself, whatever event I'm talking about is so tied up with the place. And so I'm always just taking random notes. Like in Honolulu, you know, I would be on the bus and like see that dentist's office was named after King Kamehameha, or you know, trying to get the feel of a landscape, especially describing a battle or something. And like the specifics they're like crucial for good writing, but I think they also just make things more truthful. And some of that is just elbow grease. Like sometimes working with students, there's this one exercise this friend of mine invented, and it's such a good writing exercise. I've done it with like 7-year-olds and college students, where like you could have a taxidermied anteater, and you could have that in a closet in the classroom. But before you show it to the students, you say, draw an anteater. And they just draw an anteater from memory. And then you bring out your taxidermied anteater. And then they have to actually look at it and draw that. And what they learn is they see, like, oh, when I actually like do the research, if I look at the actual thing, my drawing is so much more lifelike and true to form and just so much more interesting and specific. And so you're always trying to, like, everything that's more specific is also more truthful, I think. Because, like, that's what I do. I do nonfiction, and that truth is the goal.
But it is your truth as well, in a way.
That's such a 21st century thing to say. Yeah.
It really is.
It's my truth, sure. I still believe there is the truth on a lot of stuff. I know that's old-fashioned.
Well, I'm not even talking, you know, there definitely is the truth in some historical events and things like that, but...
Some animals are only a certain color. That's all I'm saying.
That is true.
You know?
Although in my head, when you said anteater, I pictured an armadillo and then realized my mistake, and so...
Right.
So in terms of writing then, why... We're here for Convocation, and our audience is in part students, so why is this ability to write and to tell a story, to bring out the colorful parts of the story and grab people, why is that so important in our world?
I mean, I think just the ability to communicate is always helpful, whatever you're doing in life, especially if you want to get your way. If you can frame an argument, and, you know, it's crucial to things like salesmanship or, I don't know, being a weatherman or, you know, anything. Like, the ability to communicate is never a bad skill to have. And certainly if you want, you know, career-wise and moving up, like the people who know how to lead a team or, you know, move forward in their careers, they're usually people who can communicate. But I think in terms of just study, writing helps you learn whether or not you're understanding something, whether or not you're correct in your arguments. Like, once you have to put something down on paper and back up your thoughts or marshal your arguments, that process is inherently educational. And, you know, it's how you figure out whether you've understood something, I think. So yeah. Just in terms of like an educational tool, it's really helpful.
What is your view on libraries today? Do you use them in your research, or is it?
Yeah, I do. I'm still a fairly 20th century person. So I was just asking the librarians here, like, how do people research? And it turns out they don't use physical books very much. And I use physical books a lot. So, I mean, obviously it's still the same, like you were telling me through this library, you got some of my books electronically. It's the same thing,
Yes.
like whether you're reading them on paper. Like, I'm not a snob about that. So it sounds like it's basically the same process as when I was a student. The only thing that's different, but I guess the internet is sort of the same, because when I went to college, there might have been an internet, or it was like a gleam in Al Gore's eye or something. So like this particular library building, I mean, this is going to be like Sherlock Holmes or something, but in my memory theater of this building, one thing that I find as a writer that I really loved that I didn't like as a student was, as a student, I had to write a paper on a certain subject. And I would be in this library researching it, and I would be in the stacks looking for the book I needed. And when you're looking for the book you need, you come across all these other books that are just so darn fascinating. Sometimes I would just like sit in the stacks and be like, okay, I'm just interested in this now. And I would still have to eventually do the homework. But I think, like, as a writer, that's how I kind of work. I mean, I have these things called shenanigans, where if I come across some interesting or fascinating fact or something, and it's sort of kind of off topic, I'll find a way to shoehorn it into the narrative just because, like, it's interesting, And I think some of that comes from doing research in actual libraries where you just get distracted by some other thing. But that does happen on the internet, like linking one thing to another, I guess. But it's not as tactile, or I guess.
So you'll be the person we'll find wandering the stacks.
Yeah. Libraries were definitely, especially the public library in Bozeman when I was a kid, that was a definite refuge, So same thing here, And I guess since no one's checking actual books out anymore, the stacks are probably a great quiet place to, collect your thoughts or something.
Or something.
Yeah.
So that modern libraries have changed a little bit. What about radio? Since you wrote Radio On, that was 95? Where you spent a year listening to radio. And
I mean, radio seems to be doing pretty well. I would say public radio is thriving. Montana has Montana Public Radio and Yellowstone Public Radio. They seem to be thriving. The one thing that's changed from my day is that I was a broadcaster. And now people think more in podcasts. And so when you're a broadcaster, you're broadcasting. You're just talking to the same group of people who are in the moment with you, and that has a real civic-minded beauty. Whereas a podcast is something someone does alone on their own times. And sometimes I remember I was speaking at Bozeman High School a couple of years ago, and I made them listen to one of my old radio documentaries that I had done with high school students. And they kept calling it a podcast, and it was, so old that it existed before iPods. I was like, that is not a podcast. That's from a radio show. People would drive around in their cars, and if they still wanted to hear the end of the story, they just sat there in their driveway, and there was something, not to sound like FDR or something, but there was something collective about that we've lost. And, there's still live radio, and people can still have those experiences. But the podcast thing, I understand the beauty of, finding things that you care about and listening to them on your own time. But there is just something beautiful about broadcasting and a large group of people sharing something in the moment together, So yeah. I will be a little nostalgic about that.
I think in some ways that's a lot of writing and radio and all these things do have that sense of connection.
Yeah, definitely.
Place.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, it could have been worse, right?
And thank all of you for tuning in.
Thanks.